Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Dalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday the 13th, December 13th. And indeed, after 13 years of brutal civil war, rebel forces marched on Damascus last week to topple Assad's regime in 13 days. Euphoria sprang out across Syria and the large Syrian diaspora and refugee communities scattered throughout the world. One of the most brutal dictatorships was finally vanquished. But the question is, what will happen next? Inside Syria, the big question is, who will govern? For now, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the rebel force that led to Assad's ouster, have taken over government institutions. But Syria is riven by factions, and sorting out who will govern will be no easy task. And what about Syria's neighbors? Turkey and Israel have moved swiftly to exploit the changed situation. Iran, long Assad's biggest supporter, turned tail. And the Russian Navy has just moved out of the naval base that it has possessed since the 1970s. The U.S. worries about ISIS exploiting the power vacuum. We'll discuss all of this. But there's one other story besides Syria that dominated the news. Something extraordinary happened in Romania. The Constitutional Court last week annulled a presidential election following revelations of Russian interference in those elections. The move was unprecedented, raising questions about how democracies can protect themselves in the age of social media and AI. And here to help us sort out all of these stories this week, and to analyze what's happening and why are three reporters who are covering these stories. Matt Kaminsky is editor-at-large at Politico. Catherine Philp is world affairs editor at The Times of London. And Gideon Rachman is chief foreign affairs columnist for the Financial Times. Good afternoon, Gideon, Catherine. Good morning, Matt. Great to see all of you. My God, we have a lot going on. Catherine, let's start with you. You came back from Cambodia and Vietnam thinking that was where you're going to be talking about, and then it's been Syria and Syria and Syria. Bring us up to date. What happened, and what do you think is going to happen inside this country now?
Well, that is the $1 million question. So today was the first Friday since the fall of Assad, and we saw a sort of celebratory outpouring in Damascus today. I mean, I think there were some encouraging signs there as well, that it wasn't just religious. People weren't just shouting Allahu Akbar outside the mosque. They were saying things like, hold your head up, you're a free Syrian. There were even some celebrations held in Latakia, which is the Alawite stronghold from which the House of Assad come. So, and indeed, the rebel group that you mentioned before, HTS, who have taken sort of nominal control for now, are making a lot of the right noises about how to look forward to bring together this state and to form some kind of government that can go forward for all Syrians. No, I mean, Syria has been a state in name only, possibly for perhaps even longer than this uprising has been going on. But certainly since 2011, it's extremely fractured, as we know. It's not only got the areas that were under rebel control, the areas that were under regime control. There was that time when Islamic State were able to establish a caliphate in those ungoverned spaces. It's not a natural state. I mean, I know it's we always blame Mr. Sykes and Mr. Pico for everything in the Middle East, but Syria is a very difficult state to hold together, both politically and geographically. So there's a lot to play for. You, Eva, mentioned, I think, most importantly, probably, I think that Turkey is going to be the biggest power broker in what happens next, and possibly the fact that Turkey is not going to want a chaotic failed state on its border may help it play a useful role. How the Kurds feel about that is a rather different matter. Obviously, Turkey see the Kurds as a threat. I think it was quite interesting that the Kurds in northeastern Syria have immediately adopted this flag of Free Syria, the post-Assad regime flag. And so they are signaling that they are part of this unitary state of Syria, whatever that is going forward.
Yeah, I think you paint the difficult picture of this fractured nation state that really was drawn, as you mentioned, in the collapse after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, by having a bunch of people drawing lines, whereas really not thinking about who actually lives inside of it. But it's been around now for over 100 years, and Gideon. I guess the big issue is, one, the Kurds, and they are always in this region. They're always and they have a big chunk of territory that they have, and of course supported by U.S. forces that remain inside the country. But then also various factions among Sunni rebel forces, one of which broke out, but and has now achieved victory in Damascus. How do you see this? This conglomeration getting together, and if there's a deal to be brokered, who's going to broker it?
Yeah, well, I mean, all good questions. I guess the Kurds, tend to always end up getting kind of shafted in the end, and I think there must be a slight fear that is going to happen to them again. I mean, I think that one of the major motivations of the Turks, who, as Catherine says, have the upper hand now, if any external power has the upper hand, is to crush Kurdish resistance. And it's been a bone of contention between America and Turkey, American support for the Kurdish groups who have been helpful in combating IS and so on. But if Trump follows through on his initial reaction, which was, I want absolutely nothing to do with this, and he's, maybe even withdraws the contingent of American troops that is still in Syria, then I think the Kurdish outlook is not great, unless somehow they get some kind of protection from the new Syrian state that's emerging, but that has just had all its sort of the remnants of its armed capabilities destroyed by the Israelis, the Navy. They bombed the Syrian Navy. So that's, I think, one thing to really watch out for, what happens to the Kurds in this new dispensation. And I think that I'm kind of intrigued. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on it, on the prospects for Israeli-Turkish rivalry as they both attempt to secure their interests within Syria. The Israelis moving, creating a buffer zone around the Golan, the Turks doing the same round, on their bit. I don't think the Israelis have a horse yet in the sort of internal Syrian fighting, but they clearly have very strong views about securing their interests. And they will also see the weakness of Iran. And maybe, I think the next debate in Israel would be, is this the time to try to give Iran another push, to go for a regime change in Iran? And, finally, I was on there's another podcast yesterday with a Iranian exile who said that a lot of people in Tehran are saying, well, maybe we're next. That they're hoping that their regime could be the next one to fall.
Well, I mean, we'll get to Iran issue, because I think it's fascinating how much Iran has lost in terms of standing in the region. But sticking sort of mad on the what's happening inside Syria itself, I'm struck that the commentary in Washington, in particular, has been all about ISIS. That it seems to be the only thing that people care about, and there's this sort of almost a Schadenfreude, which actually Gideon wrote about in his column. Among commentators, that, oh my God, chaos is good for ISIS, and therefore maybe we shouldn't have had chaos. How strong is ISIS? How do we think that is actually going to go? The United States actually launched a series of military strikes against ISIS concentrations. There were 9,000 ISIS fighters in Kurdish prisons, in prisons up in the Kurd-held area. How serious should we take the threat of ISIS?
Well, it's a bit like Pavlov's dog. Anytime you mention Syria, people just kind of are taken back to 2017 because that's the last time we even really thought seriously about Syria. I think it's worth just dwelling on how sudden and quick this was. And Syria was not in the headlines for years. I haven't had a conversation about Syria forever. I was in actually last week. I was in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi, and as this was coming out, I would say one thing everyone was certain of was that they'll get Aleppo, maybe they'll get Homs, but they're going to stop at Damascus and they'll let Assad stay there because it is in the interest of every neighbor for Assad to stay in place, because he may be a bastard, but he's not an ISIS bastard, and he is not an Islamist, and everyone was sort of more comfortable with that. And I think you're seeing some of that discomfort come out because just great unknown. Who are these people? What will happen? And we obviously have terrible experience in the region. Is from 2020. Late 2010, 2011, 2012, when we had great hopes for Egypt, Libya, even for a time, obviously Tunisia, and those kind of dropped like dominoes and are now basket cases. So I think that is a great thing. I think that it's not really, and we'll get to the region in a second, but I think the immediate worry is not really, I would say the next front is Iraq, which is the next door country, and how do you sort of push Iran out of Iraq next? And this is where I think the last thing I would just come away, my impression in Riyadh is that people just wanted to ignore Syria and ignore troubles in the region, but now kind of realize that one, it's too dangerous to ignore, and two, there's a great opportunity there. Like you've helped things to Netanyahu, you've pushed Iran out of Lebanon or really decimated Lebanon, you break their kind of hold on Syria. Now, do you sort of push them back in Iraq itself, and then you may kind of grapple with Iran itself? The meandering answer that I'm giving you, I think, reflects the state of the conversation about this. That in our conversation, we just don't know because, again, as of 7 days ago, as of 14 days ago, this wasn't even imaginable. It's not on anyone's bingo list for 2024 was the fall of Assad.
Yeah, nobody's bingo list had the fall of Assad and martial law in South Korea in December. That's clear. And Assad was in Riyadh 3.5 weeks ago, being feted as the stabilizing force in the region.
They're trying to bring him back in. This was kind of let's normalize him. We got to work with him. He's there for the next 25 years.
Yeah, and now he will be doing ophthalmology in Moscow or something. I guess that's what we're doing. Catherine, one thing that struck me, and that will start to broaden out the conversation a little bit, but one thing that struck me is that the first foreign visitor, the last foreign visitor was the Iranian foreign minister, who told them it'll all be fine, and then immediately took out all the Iranian citizens when it turned out it wasn't fine. And the next one was the intelligence chief of Turkey, who was there yesterday, running around Damascus, and it does demonstrate that if there is one clear winner out of this conflict, it is Erdogan, who, of course, almost alone as world leaders stood up against Assad from day one. The U.S. had rhetorical and the Europeans had rhetorical opposition to Assad. They didn't do anything. The Turks did. And by the way, they also suffered the consequences of with refugees and everything else in large numbers. And you do wonder whether the Turks might be the mastermind in brokering some deal. And as we already mentioned, the Kurds won't like that. But there are a lot of other people who may be willing to work with them. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think the Turks, I think that we'll find out a lot more about what the Turks have been up to in the last few weeks and the conversations they've been having. I rather suspect they've been talking to Moscow as well. That although Russia has left that port, you mentioned the naval port, they haven't left the airbase. There was a report today from Quentin Somerville at the BBC who was talking about Russian soldiers going in and out of that airbase. So I think, it's it's very likely that they will try and hold on to that. It's critical to some of the Russian operations in Africa. But of course, Turkey's a bit of a rival for Russian influence in Africa as well. So there's a lot to play for here. I think it was interesting. I think that, there was some time probably over the last 2 years or so where Erdogan was trying to speak to Assad about the issue of the refugees that Turkey was hosting, and sort of try to get to a position whereby he could, justify pushing those refugees back, because that was creating political problems for him in Turkey. As it's turned out, he may have made that possible by other means. We've already seen a lot of the far right parties in Europe immediately jump up and say, right, let's send all the Syrians back. Germany was the first to stop processing asylum claims. It's now happening in several countries, including the UK, where I'm speaking to you from. Erdogan does have an interest in that as a particular interest, is to get these millions of Syrians out of Turkey and back there. He's got a lot of influence in I think not only within what happens in Syria, but also with the other countries who might want to see the same kind of outcomes when it comes to the diaspora.
And I mean, of course, getting the refugees back into Syria, that's one thing. Having the refugees being taken care of in a country that is truly devastated is something else, which is why a lot of these refugees are saying, well, wait a minute, where are we going back to? And you see the resistance already coming there as well. But it is opening up new avenues. Gideon, let's broaden the aperture a little bit. You wrote this week, I mentioned in your column, that there was this nostalgia for, the certainty of Assad controlling Syria, which, by the way, he didn't really do. A large part of the country was controlled by other people. But as Matt also said, the Gulfies and everybody else was just hoping everything would be fine. And there is sort of this worry now that everything won't be fine. Sort of take us through Turkey. We just talked about Israel, which, really destroyed the Syrian military, not just the Navy, the Air Force, its chemical weapons depots, lots of other things in the last week. The U.S., which is worried about ISIS, Russia, which wants to keep its base. The air base is critical for its support, as Catherine said, in Africa. Everyone wants a piece of this, and no one knows how to do it because they don't have relations with many of the people who are now in power.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that would worry me about the future of Syria, is that there are too many outsiders with interests in that country, and the country itself is flat on its back after, all the last sort of devastating decade. So it could become a kind of playground. I use that word advisedly, but, an area where different outside factions are backing different groups. And you get another kind of civil war, or at least deep uncertainty. I mean, I'm thinking Libya, Sudan. You already have examples of that, where there are various factions, all of which have some outside backer in a very confusing mosaic. But one thing you can be sure of is it's not good for the country itself, which tends to look like a failed state before too long. In terms of the US, you and I saw each other in Washington last week, and talking to, I was very struck talking to a couple of current US officials. They'll both be out of work soon, but they're currently dealing with this. Firstly, events were still unfolding, but they still didn't really seem to see Syria as the centerpiece of the Middle East, even as things were happening very dramatically. One of them said Syria is just a subset of the Iranian problem. And they were very focused on Iran and on Israel-Palestine. Maybe that was just, as I say, it takes a while to catch up with events. But again, another one, though, is sort of involved in the kind of head-scratching about what American policy should be, said to me, it's odd. Normally, in an international kind of crisis, we at least have an idea of how we want things to turn out. But in this one, we're actually not even sure what our preferred outcome is, which is partly why I wrote about this sort of deep ambivalence to the fall of Assad. But it seemed to me that those questions are legitimate. They really are things we should start worrying about maybe from now. But it's you don't want to get yourself into a position where you say, yeah, I want this incredibly brutal dictator who has thousands of people in the underground cells, and that 90% of the deaths in the Syrian civil war caused by his forces. Yeah, I think he's the guy we want to hang on to. I think that's not a position we want to be in. It's not geopolitically, it's a bad idea, and morally, obviously, it's terrible.
Yeah, and it's no longer possible, even though you do have a sense, Matt, that there is that everybody is scrambling to figure out what to do next, and they all are looking through Syria through the lens not of Syria but their own particular interests. The Iranians lost big time because they've lost their bridge and their land bridge to Lebanon. Hezbollah, of course, has lost big time. The Israelis are, I probably can't believe their luck right now on what's happened. And I'm glad we have Gideon, another podcaster. Your cat.
Yeah, he might be able to make more sense than I do.
So I don't know whether you've been talking to people inside the administration or indeed in the Trump world who basically are saying, well, this is none of our business. We're out of here. Or at least that's the president's view. And I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be the view when they're actually in power and responsible for. But you do have a sense of people, I think head scratching is the right word, Gideon, that Gideon used, and people really have no idea.
Yeah, but I think also this is an incredibly, let's say, talk about fork in the roads. I think if you think about the history of the Middle East the last 25 years, let's say, so 9/11 was, the sort of shock of that attack, Al-Qaeda, followed by what we know happened in the Iraq War, the rise of the extremist groups. Then you had the Arab Spring moment, which was a kind of brief hope, followed by collapse. I hadn't really been engaging with the Middle East until I spent the bulk of the last month there. And this is a very different moment in the region than those two previous kind of key points. When you travel around the UAE or Saudi or obviously the Gulf, I mean, they're oil rich, but they're also the amount of sort of they're focused on the economy. They're focused on technology, on AI, on investment. You have so much capital coming out of there, so much interest. And when you're Saudi is no longer trying to be an Arab superpower. They really want to protect the transformation they're trying to bring about internally, social and economic. The same thing with the Gulf states. And this is actually real. This is a real. The Gulf the UAE is doing really well. Saudi still TBD, but the amount of change you've had there the last 10 years is astounding. And it is in the interest of both those players and ultimately in the interest of the U.S. to try and use this moment to try and really to attempt to kind of bring about, a region that is much more stable, much more prosperous. Because the biggest threat to that prosperity and the biggest threat to those plans to remake the Middle East is Iran. It is instability in the Levant, and I think this is why. And the U.S. is really the only game in town. The Chinese did broker a deal between the Iranians and the Saudis. The Russians have tried to kind of create built a kind of a naval base that's not really a naval base, but ultimately the U.S. is the only power that matters there. It is. Both the soft and the hard connections to the U.S. from the region are what they are. I also think you are going to get even back on the agenda as soon as possible, as soon as Gaza kind of gets out of the front pages. The Saudi, Israeli, American talks on normalization. The Saudis want security guarantees from the U.S. And so I do think this is not the conclusion, but we're kind of coming to the end of the post-October 7th period here, where Israel feels fairly good about having done what it did to Hamas, very good about what it did to Hezbollah, uncertain about Syria, but anything that weakens Iran is a good thing. And I think there is an opportunity to strike some kind of deal that will sort of really institutionalize a stronger Saudi-American relationship, but as a result, kind of further normalize things with Israel. And that would be a big step forward.
So I think that puts the big picture, Catherine, on the table, and I think there is that opportunity, perhaps. I mean, let's put it this way: the smart American diplomacy could perhaps come about to have the next step of the remaking of the Middle East in a more positive direction. It seems to me there are two wild cards in this. One wild card is Iran, which is what does Iran want, and clearly. If you are the supreme leader and you're looking at how you have been weakened over the past year, there's really one thing they have left in their drawer, which is nuclear weapons, which is why they're accelerating the creation of nuclear weapons. There's also a deal with the United States, which is the other thing, and the two are not; they may be related. And the other one is Israel. Which now seems to really believe that the post-October 7, they have achieved the security they were looking for, except for one thing, Iran. So help us play this out. How does this? How do you think this will evolve? Is this the moment that will be seized that transforms the Middle East to a stable future, or is this the moment where the confrontation that Bibi Netanyahu has spent his entire career on is about to come forward?
I mean, it feels like an inflection point of the scale of sort of 2003. The US invasion of Iraq, which of course had this consequence of removing that bulwark against Iran, and in fact, unintendedly empowering Iran in the region in a way. So the fall of Assad in Syria, of course, as you say, kind of shatters that whole post 2003 dynamic. I am Matt has been in Riyadh much more recently than I have, so would know this better, but I have been interested by the amount of signaling that's coming out of Riyadh at the moment about the likelihood of normalization with Israel, in which they've been playing it down quite a lot and using some quite loaded language about what is going on in Gaza. So, the G word, genocide, has been used by MBS himself to describe it. So I think that the Saudis are playing a bit of hardball here. And I think one of the reasons for that probably is that they, I imagine, have doubts about whether Trump, with his, isolationist tendencies, is really prepared to give those security guarantees that Saudi would need to do that deal. October 7th, it is extraordinary if you think that's, it's barely over a year. It felt at the time that essentially the efforts by regional players, by the US and stuff, to do deals over the heads of the Palestinians, to try and ignore this, the burning issue of the Israel-Palestine conflict, exploded in their faces in October 7th. But of course, now the chain of events that has unfolded since then, where does that go? Do the regional, do the Arab powers continue to show any interest in the Palestinians, whether it's simply because of the so-called Arab street care about it? We all know that none of them really care that much in a moral capacity. I don't think. I think it's always been a very opportunistic issue for them. So I do think it's a transformative moment. I'm not sure where that transformation leads us. And like you, I do think that that there is this risk with that Iran, with its back to the wall, goes for the nuclear option. If you feel like you've lost everything else, all your other assets, you've lost Hezbollah, who were your sort of sub-nuclear option, that's where you might go.
Yeah, it certainly looks like that. And Gideon, we had that discussion just last week in Washington in some way. And it seems Matt's right that the U.S. is the only game in town. I mean, the Russians are no longer the game. The Chinese are playing it very, very safe. They care most about making sure they get oil. The Europeans, I'm afraid, they're not playing. So it's really the U.S. And on the one hand, you do have this deal. You have a deal with Iran, then leading to a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which would have to include something for the Palestinians. And if there's one person who might be able to have the strength to do that, it might be Donald Trump, who could get, because he has that. He's probably the only one that the Iranians will make a deal with that thinks that it would stick. And yet, is he interested in that?
Well, I think he might be interested if he could be guaranteed ahead of time that he'd get the Nobel Peace Prize if it was.
I'll give it to him if he can get it.
I don't know. I mean, I think that, as you know, Trump world's very hard to read because there are so many different competing factions, which are partly, I think, often primarily based on personality and ego, but also there's different ideologies in there. So there's this group, the Restrainers, as christened by our friend Jeremy Shapiro, and they seem to have adopted the title because they prefer it to isolationists, who are very much arguing, don't go there. And I think they believe that basically Trump shares their instincts. And if you look at his social media post as Syria was collapsing, he was immediately sort of, Syria's a mess, we should go nowhere near it. I think that is what he thinks. But whether
sand and death, I think he called it. Yeah,
yeah, he has a way with words. One wonders, but whether people around him will persuade him that maybe America should play an active role, and that if it doesn't,
well, starting with his son-in-law, right? I mean, whose entire business venture depends on billions in Saudi money, and I think, and along with, I can think of people like David Solomon or anyone who runs big bank here in New York, who really are desperate to kind of get Saudi business. I think that the sort of the thing that gives Saudis pause is really whether the Senate would pass a treaty, a NATO-like treaty that would guarantee its security. It is inarguable. The Saudis are going to protest. We care about the Palestinians as we always do. There's some talk in Riyadh that King Salman has kind of woken up from his kind of dementia-induced sort of nap over the last many years, and actually put his foot down on this, saying we're not going to do a deal with the Palestinians involved. The fact of the matter is they just don't care about the Palestinians. I mean, the Saudi elite, they care about a deal with Israel that will guarantee their security and ensure that the country can continue down and try and diversify an economy that one day will run out of oil, and is a country where 70% of the people are under the age of 35 and need jobs and need opportunities. And this is really about the survival of the House of Saud, and peace with Israel is central to it. It happens to be in American interest. Trump is incredibly proud of the Abraham Accords, and as he should be. And I can, whatever he said on that weird social media channel he posts on, I think as it regards to the wider region, I would think that they would be very keen and very open to making deals. And I think the Israelis would be very open to that as well. I mean, October 7th really did bring home, I think, the need for the deal even more so than a pre-October 7th for the Saudis. It froze those talks, but it also made them think, we got to get this done because of Iran and because we have our own domestic Hamas problem, and have to strengthen the regime's foundations, which they think this would do, as long as they have to be aware of the public opinion, even though it's a authoritarian state, and have to sort of say that they care about the Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, the big news for the Saudis, obviously, this week has been they got the World Cup of 2034.
At the World Cup, they had the biggest film festival in the region. They had Jennifer Lopez, wearing nothing on stage last month in a fashion show from El Isab.
It's a new world. It's a new world.
Saudi Arabia, I think that's
the only thing I do think the Saudis will wonder about is not only whether the Senate would ratify a treaty, but if you have a treaty with Donald Trump, that it actually means what he thinks it is. And they have this 2019 experience when the Iranians did attack and destroyed half their refining capacity, and the United States did nothing, which has been a real fundamental reason for why they want these security guarantees, but security guarantees from a president who doesn't believe in treaties,
and also a president who might be about to willingly or not, I mean, sort of consciously or not, to greenlight further Israeli annexation of the West Bank.
Yes, and part of more of the Golan Heights, etc. So and Gaza. So it is interesting, but there is an opportunity. I think that's. As our former mayor, current U.S. ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel always said, never let a crisis go to waste. And this is one of those crises you shouldn't let go to waste. Speaking of a different crisis, not a very elegant chain topic, but we'll try. Matt, Romania. Stunning election results in the first round. A man who came almost from nowhere, far right soil scientist, I believe he is, Mr. Georgescu, came on first in the first round, and just before the second round was supposed to be voted on last Sunday, this constitutional court ruled that the election was annulled because of information that the Russians had interfered in the election in one form or another. What are we to make of this? What do we really think about a democracy having voted, and by all accounts, where the votes were counted accurately, a constitutional court stepping in and saying, "Nah, we don't like it."
I'm going to avoid even mentioning the name of the country or of the candidates, because I think that's will confuse us, and it also lends itself to thinking, the land of Dracula, sort of foggy, misty mountains, and they do things differently. Imagine if this happened in the Netherlands, that you have a legitimate election, you've had a democracy since, in this case, for the last 35 years, you believe in the institutions, you have an election, people use the tools of modern media to campaign, it's all out in the open, and one candidate wins the first round and then is favored to go and win the second round. Moreover, this is a system where the prime minister holds the bulk of executive powers day to day. You had an election at the same time in this country X. The pro-European center-left party won there, and the prime minister will actually be from that wing of the politics. But heading into the following week's presidential round, this guy who's not completely unknown, he's been around in Iranian politics for a while. He was nominated for prime minister, I think, 3 years ago. There's a challenge to the Constitutional Court, and the court overrules its electoral authorities and says, no, stop. This thing doesn't count because there were, and then you bring out some intelligence reports. There were maybe Russian money involved, and you punt it into May. So what happens? A couple of things, like, well, is this a democracy or not? If it was so egregious and illegal, who's being prosecuted? If there are sort of I think, and what it also does, it makes probably strengthens that candidate even more, because that person becomes a political martyr, and heading into May will probably be favored. I think it's also unfortunate because there are real questions about Russian interference and real concerns about Russian interference in votes. You're going to have a big election in Poland for president next year, potentially with the far right coming back there. But the way to fight this is with openness, not with legal fiat. And speaking from America, we have very bad memories here of 2000, where there's a perception that the Supreme Court came in and decided an electoral race was kind of hung over that president Bush for many years. So I think this is not a win for democracy, and it's not a win for Europe.
Catherine, how do you see it? I mean, it's a really complicated issue. Yes, clearly there was interference, but there's interference in a lot of places.
Yeah.
I mean,
the most similar thing I can think of that I've covered recently was I was in Moldova ahead of the referendum and the presidential election there, and I mean that was tight. That vote. It shouldn't have looked like that. I mean, I think, the polls told a completely different story beforehand. I think 63% were in favor of EU accession or, going in that direction. And then, of course, it only squeaked by with barely 50%, and there was huge amounts of Russian interference. So I mean, just a few votes either side of that, Moldova could have found itself in a very similar situation. Where what do you do? So I mean, the interference issue is a real one. I mean, I think also I can't remember who made the point earlier, Ivo, whether it was you or Gideon, about TikTok. Maybe not being quite the tool it could have been, because most of the voters were over 50 for this particular candidate, so unlikely to be influenced by TikTok. I mean, I think there's a lot for the digital detectives to go through and see what, as Matt said, for investigations to be seriously conducted into what kind of interference there really was and how influential it was, because this is going to happen in lots of places, and one day it could be the Netherlands or France.
Well, I mean, Gideon, I think that's exactly right. Matt mentioned Poland, huge, big election there with actually huge consequences for relationship with Russia. So the Russians are very interested. And another election coming up in Germany that is hugely important.
Less dramatically than Germany, but also Bulgaria is on to its fifth election. I think they've had 5 elections in 2 years. There's a classic deadlocked government. They're going to go for another one. And there is a sort of Orban figure lurking around, very pro-Russian, who people think will at some point enter the political scene. The Russians will put their backing behind. And, if you're Russian, you can pick off Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. All NATO members, all EU members. That's a huge sort of wedge into the sort of anti-Russian bloc in the EU and in Eastern Europe. But that said, whether cancelling the election is the way to go, I have my doubts, and I don't know Romania that well, but colleagues who follow it more closely said that the Romanian elite had interests to protect, have not. Are not popular. There is corruption, and so, as well as being about Russian interference, it might have been just about an elite panicking that it was going to be swept away on a tide of anti-elite populism, with unfortunate consequences for them personally rather than the country. I mean, it's difficult to disentangle from a distance how all these elements weighed against each other, but it sure doesn't look good, does it? I mean, it reminds me a bit of. It's perhaps a slightly stretched comparison, but the Hunter Biden pardon, where suddenly liberals are open to charges of hypocrisy. Well, you're always insisting, play by the rules, et cetera, until suddenly there's something big at stake for you. And then you say, oh, well, actually, you overturn the rule book or rip it up.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it strikes me there is really 2 fundamental principles here, which is that we do have a problem with Russian interference in elections. And social media and AI and other and just old-fashioned spying and interference is a major part. And we also have elections that should be run and votes should be counted, and the results should be should then be upheld, even if we don't like the election results. But where we are now, I mean, I'm struck by how silent people have been about, I mean, including in the United States, including the EU, about what is truly unprecedented. The Supreme Court, a court does not annul elections, which, by the way, are by every account, the votes as cast were counted in the accurate way. There's no sense that this wasn't the case. It's a big deal.
Well, you're getting weird things happening in a lot of U.S.-aligned democracies. South Korea, you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, no, and it does start to raise really fundamental questions about democracy. And yes, I mean, I can paint the picture. Slovakia is the other country, by the way, under Russian influence. But if that there is a real Russian influence that is happening, but there must be another way in which we can combat that than saying, well, let's not have elections anymore because we don't like the outcome.
And it also, of course, fuels that, far-right narrative about the deep state and globalization and, the global elite wanting to just make sure everything goes in their direction. I mean, it's absolute grist for their mill.
Matt, last word to you. I mean, you ultimately, are we able to square this circle?
I think it's a gift for Putin at a moment when he should be feeling quite weak, especially after what happened in Syria, which both was a setback for him strategically. There was also a reminder of how weak ultimately regimes like this are. I mean, they all seem really, really strong until the moment they don't, and they kind of crumble very quickly. And I think Putin is aware of how quickly his regime can crumble, which is why he's so paranoid about doing everything to keep it standing up. I think for Europe itself, it's just part of I think for the whole Western world, I don't think democracy is endangered as its brand has been tarnished, and it's being tarnished repeatedly. And this is just the other example of it.
Tarnished democracies and crumbling dictatorships. That seems to be 2025 for us. And highlighting all of that are three of my favorite people to have this discussion with: Catherine Phillip of the London Times, Gideon Ruckman of the Financial Times, Matt Kaminsky of Politico, and all of you for tuning in, watching and listening. Wonderful to have you. Thanks so much for doing so. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.